Welcome back to The Followers, everybody. Today's episode, I still don't know what episode it is, but we had a great episode. We had a great guest, Brendan O'Keefe, on today. So we were talking all things fitness testing. I find it super interesting, especially with fitness testing in the schools context, so with their youths. What did you think about, John?
Yeah, I really like just the way he said, because there tends to be a bit of controversy around fitness testing in schools, but it's not why are we fitness testing, how are we, because the context around it is what tends to make the big difference around enjoyment, learning, meaning from what the results actually give you, as opposed to saying, no, fitness testing is bad or fitness testing is good. It's a bit deeper than that.
Yeah, for me it was just like most things is circling around the why we're actually doing this and then how to get that information. I thought we had an interesting conversation there around the actual role a PE teacher has in a wider context in schools as well, and just that whole health side to physical education and that. So those we actually covered quite a varied I suppose topic guide today, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, we kind of focused on the big split within the amount of people you get in school. So again, if you have an elite athlete in your class, odds are if they're playing intercounty football, they're getting fitness tested at that. So they're not really the people you're worried about collecting data for. It's everybody else and kind of what you can do with that data to help them is kind of the real course that we went down. Anyway, super interesting chat. So here it is now.
Bit of a change around in background there over the last year or so. You're a solid UL man. Then went up the road to DCU, but came crawling your way back there to UL a couple of months ago, did you?
Yeah. Back to base, John. Back to base. Look, I suppose in April 2020, I finished up my doctorate and had been in UL there for the previous 4 years. And I over the summer, then last summer, I was lucky enough to take on a position in DCU, and I was lecturing there in the department of the School of Health and Human Performance for the past year. And then over the summer, a lecturing role came up in the PES department. So back to the PES for the third time now, having done my undergrad there. So just settling into the semester. We've started teaching there last Monday. So it's going good so far.
And background was as a PE teacher. That's what you originally started off doing. Did it for a bit of a while before you went back further down the research route.
Yeah. So I graduated, I think it was the year after you actually in the PE department, the PES department there in UL, and went out teaching then in Glenstal Abbey School just outside Limerick there for 2 years. And I kind of always had the intention, to be honest, of pursuing further study. And initially I was going to actually go straight into it. I had funding to go straight into the doctorate after completing the undergrad. But I this position came up in Glenstal, and I was delighted that I did it and went out and got that kind of real world experience in the schools. And then in 2016, I made a successful application to the Irish Research Council for funding, and that kind of allowed me then to go full time at the doctoral studies from September, October 2016, right up until April 2020. Yeah.
And that general idea, was it something like when you originally had funding there at the end of the undergrad degree, was the same idea you went on and did, or did it evolve throughout the couple of years teaching based on stuff you noticed on the ground?
Yeah, it definitely evolved. So I suppose that the research area itself is health related physical fitness and monitoring health related fitness in schools, and what forms, what methodologies teachers employ in schools for fitness testing, specifically in fitness education units more broadly. And I suppose it definitely evolved in that it was a postdoc, David Kelly, who was originally meant to take on this the PhD that turned out to be mine, and he took on a role elsewhere, and the funding became available then, and I suppose where I was coming from was I wanted to get a feel for what was actually being done in schools, because it was an area of huge interest for me. Health-related physical fitness, students, youth, obviously being a teacher, particularly among youth populations. And, I had heard of lots of anecdotes of it being implemented very, very poorly, read like several research papers about how it might be a misdirected effort at health promotion. But from my own experience of implementing it, I had a very different experience, and I was keen to pursue that further and look into, is there research out there around effective methods, effective approaches to implementing fitness ed units and testing specifically in school settings, and that's really where it all kicked off.
And you've drawn from like work in other countries and that, but like at a basic level, first off, what do we actually test? Like people probably think immediately of, oh sure, you do the beep test and you get the scores, go, this is medium and this is bad, and that's it. But there are far more components to just what the beep test measures. Do you want to maybe touch on a few of those? You know, you said you focus largely on health related fitness, but you know, there are other components that fit into other categories as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose, like in the first place, it might help to just give a broad definition of what we're talking about. So physical fitness can be defined very simply as the ability to perform everyday tasks or exercise without undue fatigue. And when we're talking about physical fitness, it can be divided into two primary categories, and they are health-related physical fitness and performance-related fitness. And when we're talking about health-related fitness, those are the components that we know have a very direct relationship with future health, a proven relationship with current or future health status. And performance-related fitness, then, they are the components that are necessary for optimum sports performance. So in terms of health-related fitness, we're looking at, it's debatable, but usually I would categorise as four broad components. They include cardiorespiratory endurance, body composition, musculoskeletal fitness, so that includes muscular strength, muscular power and endurance, and then one that I would have with a bit of an asterisk, flexibility, which is still categorized as a component, but there's an emerging research, emerging evidence to suggest that maybe it shouldn't be a standalone component of health-related fitness. Then in terms of performance-related fitness, you're looking at agility, balance, coordination, power, reaction time, speed. Again, it's not an exact science in terms of what's a specific component of performance-related fitness. It's much more broad, but they'd be your broad pillars of both health and performance-related fitness.
Even though it's like when we teach this in 5th and 6th year, like you'd notice that the health-related components of fitness, they're important for your health, but most of them translate across to performance as well, whereas some of the performance ones don't really translate across. Like if you have poor levels of agility, now what is agility is a whole other thing we can go into here now, but if you have poor levels of agility, probably not really impacting on your health. But if you have poor levels of strength or cardiorespiratory endurance, definitely going to impact your health. But also the majority of sports you're going to play, unless perhaps darts, is it a sport or not, possibly not going to, it's like going to have an impact on that then as well.
No, 100%. Yeah, that's it. And just to build on that, then, like, kind of, for me, that comes back to the point I was making in terms of flexibility. Yes, having a good, we'll say, whatever agility test that you're using, having a good score on that probably would likely transfer to positive health outcomes. The same goes for flexibility, but the reality is that it's pretty equivocal, and in the absence of having very firm evidence for it, questions can be raised in whether it should be categorized as a component of health related fitness or what you're describing there. Yeah,
because I suppose it does as well come into how you actually measure there, and without going too into detail of that just yet, but if you're measuring cardiorespiratory endurance and you measure through running, cycling, swimming, whatever, at like a somewhat lower level, like not elite stat, something like that, there will be a fair commonality across how you actually test it. Whereas flexibility is so different based on whether it's around the hip, around the shoulder, through the trunk, whatever like that, and then how that can possibly relate to health is just so different across those. Like,
yeah, like again, it's a quote from the IOM, the Institute of Medicine in the US, but it states that like the specificity of flexibility to the joint precludes or basically it results in that it's very hard to form direct relationships or to measure direct relationships with health outcomes then, because you might have exceptionally flexible hamstrings, but that's not to say that your upper body or shoulder region is exceptionally flexible. So I think that's really where the some of the issue lies. Yeah.
And just to look at some more practical examples then, some of the components of fitness then are the ones we tend to measure most. where like are they used first of all in everyday life? Like why are they actually important for health? And then maybe slightly touch on how is it, and like it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but it's no harm reinforcing it. Why some of them are important for performance in one or two of the more popular sports or activities.
Yeah, well, if you look at, I mentioned there two of the most prominent components would be cardiorespiratory endurance and musculoskeletal fitness, and I suppose I've a particular interest in the area of musculoskeletal fitness, and that's within that. Then there are three key pillars, and they would be muscular strength, muscular power, and muscular endurance. And for me, in everyday life, the ability, stuff that we probably take for granted, whether it's to bend over, pick up a school bag, taking books out of a locker, for older people to grab something from a high press, to open a tight jar, to open a bottle of milk. These are all things that are very, very basic, but require a certain level of muscular strength or muscular endurance if it's done repeatedly over time. So even though, and this is a big thing in terms of youth and the tracking of health related fitness, even though we might not see it it immediately in terms of its importance among youth populations, we know that these measures track very, very well over time, and there's also been a huge amount of longitudinal data now emerging in the past 10 years, basically showing that the health-related fitness components that I've mentioned, cardiorespiratory endurance, musculoskeletal fitness and body composition, they are very, very powerful predictors of future health. So from a health perspective, we know that the basics of your components of health-related fitness are really, really important in terms of being able to carry out daily tasks, simple things later in life, and obviously that has a positive impact in terms of your quality of life. And then in terms of sport, the second part of your question, I suppose, even though we categorize them as health and performance related fitness components, two separate categories, there is absolutely transferability across the two, because, our dominant sports, we'll take it in an Irish context, our dominant field-based sports, so Gaelic games, soccer, rugby, require high levels of both cardiorespiratory endurance, or your ability to perform exercise over long periods of time, but also musculoskeletal fitness, so whether it's power, strength, or endurance, and all three really. So there's definitely I suppose it can be viewed through a health sphere or a performance sphere. Both are relevant. Yeah.
And just looking at why do we actually conduct these tests in schools? Like and your work was largely done in secondary schools, but there are some of the kind of common tests done in primary schools around reading age and your kind of maths ages, the sigma t and micro something else, I'm not quite sure the names. Just look at where reading ages are and what numeracy ability and all like is that why we should look to fitness tests in schools to see where we are across the board? Is it more on an individual level to just inform the students themselves where they're at? Is it somewhere in between, or are both important?
Yeah, like I would make, and this is something I'd be really strong on, I'd make a very firm distinction between testing for the purpose of gathering data and testing for the purpose of learning. So, for me, first and foremost, the reason that you'd incorporate as a PE teacher, or even if you're, as a primary school teacher, if you're interested in doing it, the purpose really should be a learning focus. The objective here is that the test forms part of a broader fitness education unit, and it's not just implemented on a once-off basis. Students arrive in, will do the bleep test. No, it really needs to form part of a much, much broader fitness aid unit, or whatever it is that you're doing, and that it's integrated as part of that, and students have the opportunity to familiarize themselves with what exactly that they're doing and why they're doing it. If the purpose, and it is a very important purpose as well, is for gathering data and to look at secular trends and to look at, okay, how are we actually doing as a nation? Is it are our fitness levels in general declining? Are they increasing? Well, then that for me would be separate from the physical education context, and that is also really, really important. We do it very poorly in Ireland, but to be fair, things like the CESPA study have made, there's made efforts recently to include more measures of health-related fitness, not just survey-based measures, because we know, as I've mentioned already, that that these components are among the most powerful predictors of future health later in life. So there's no reason that health surveys, specifically for the purpose of gathering data, shouldn't include basic measures like hand grip strength, standing broad jump, and so on. Yeah.
It's also an opportunity to look at, maybe sometimes what cross-sectionally they can link up with. That, like, if someone has high levels of fitness, is it associated with something else that we maybe would not otherwise have noticed? Like I even noticed in one of my own studies there, looking at mental health outcomes, that did any markers of physical fitness link with mental health outcomes, and actually BMI was the only one with any kind of significant association. None of the rest of them did. It was quite a small sample, but nothing to predict it at all. You said there as well about when doing MP, it's for education, whereas otherwise it's for, like, if it is for gathering data. Should that perhaps be kept completely separate to PE, or linked in but with much less of an emphasis on it from the school itself, and have it near like someone external coming in to gather that, if it is for the purpose of gathering data?
Yeah, interestingly enough, one of the studies I did actually gathered data on that specific question, and I asked students, who do you like gathering this data? Do you like doing it with your peers, or would you rather someone external? Would you rather your teacher to do it, or would you rather to do it yourself in your own time? And what we found is that there was definitely students were not in favour of either their teacher or someone external coming in to take these measures. They were much more in favour of either doing it in their small groups of their closest peers, or self-assessing. So, again, in the learning or physical education context, John, I would say that is very much, that should be the goal then, that we listen to the student voice and we implemented it using those small group strategies, where we essentially give students the accountability, responsibility for taking their own measures. We go through what's the purpose of it, talk them through the protocols and why these components are important, and they are then given the responsibility to go in and measure, or it might form part of, for example, an activity profile where they're looking to develop one or two specific components. Well, if they know how to, in order to do that, they need to know how to measure it, to know in the first place if they're deficient in that specific area. And you'll know with the introduction of the new examinable leaving certificate subject in PE, conducting needs analysis has become really, really important. And what a brilliant skill for young students to learn, to being able to conduct a needs analysis for their specific or their preferred sporting activity. What areas do I need to improve on? In order to do that effectively, you need to know how to measure your components of health and performance related fitness. Yeah.
And something I'm sure loads of people are wondering, like, having looked at like a range of fitness tests in Ireland, and you conducted a few even as one of your earlier studies, how do we actually compare to other countries? I know it wasn't one of the main purposes, but it was a question you sought to dig into a little bit.
Yeah, it was, and originally it wasn't a main objective of my thesis, but we just had basically part of my one component of my doctoral thesis was to a randomised sample of 20 schools, so a randomised stratified sample of 20 schools in the mid and southwest region of Ireland, and it involved over 1,200 students. So we had a really big data set there. Now we focused on first years, but I wanted to kind of see, okay, how did we compare with and for that study that you're mentioning, we compared to European norms. So I want to see, how do we fare against European normative data? And interestingly enough, we actually compared quite favourably across the CRE components, so the cardiorespiratory endurance, body composition components. No major difference, or in fact Irish children actually performed a bit better. The area that really stood out and threw up a lot of significant results was the disparity in muscular strength, and specifically measured through hand grip strength and the standing broad jump. So European adolescents had much higher musculoskeletal fitness in comparison to the Irish students, and they were age matched as well, roughly 12 to 14 year olds. So that was one finding of particular interest. Yeah.
How did it compare, kind of going across from not necessarily on the results of the fitness testing, but maybe the frequency or how often they were carried out? Like, are they much more embedded into the curriculum in Europe, or was that something you explored?
It's kind of not something I explore, Shane, but something I'd be familiar with just from going to conferences and things. It's very much an east-west divide in Europe. The Eastern European countries, there are some countries that have mandated fitness testing. It runs 2 or 3 times per year. They have huge, massive data sets that it's almost just part of the curriculum and taken for granted. So countries like Slovenia have the SlowFit test battery, Hungary NetFit test battery, and they just. It's just part of their it's part of their almost part of their culture, really. So they would have it on a very regular basis, whereas the more Western countries, we look at the UK, France, Spain, it's more an ad hoc basis, and it's very much, it's not centralized. A lot of those ones that I mentioned earlier will be operated on a central level by the government and done through schools then, whereas it's more ad hoc in the likes of the UK, France, Spain, where it's the individual teacher themselves, up to themselves how they implement it. So yeah, that's kind of how it breaks down. Yeah.
The differences that were noted there in muscular strength from Irish children or adolescents compared to other countries, any idea why that might be the case? Is it possibly due to the extra testing, or like, do you even... do you have that, like you could suggest, it might be because of this?
Yeah, it's something we did explore in the discussion of that paper, and for me, probably the most, what would you say, like one of the most obvious reasons would be that, the dominant sports in an Irish if we take standing broad jump, for example, the dominant sports in Spain and France are often the likes of your basketball, volleyball, sports that require high power output, whether it be vertical jump or broad jump, moving across the surface. Whereas in Ireland, at a younger level, or field sports like Gaelic games are very much cardiorespiratory endurance. It's more movement based over much larger spaces. So that would be one possible theory. I haven't data to back that up, but just based on we know what the popular sports are in Ireland in comparison to the most popular in Europe, that might be one potential reason for the disparity, specifically in terms of musculoskeletal fitness.
Yeah, no, that's interesting as well, because I'm even thinking, like, when we had Stephen Bean on before, and we note like some of the lower levels of fundamental movement skill ability, and with like jumping and landing and stuff like that, because they're quite poor at that. Is it partly the actual skill of jumping is an impact, and then because through jumping and landing you develop like muscular strength through those, because they don't put as much of an emphasis on those at a younger age? Is that potentially why as well? But no, it's an interesting one. And to take it back to the physical education area, when testing and when gathering information as a class for the individuals in the group, how does that then inform potentially the teachers, but most importantly the students themselves? Like, you've done a test, what does that actually mean, or what do we do with this information now that we've seen it?
Yeah, like by asking the question, you're really much touching upon what we need to be doing in that, the test isn't conducted in isolation, that it needs to form part of something bigger. And I remember one of your earlier episodes, you did a quick episode, I think it was around the 20s, around fitness testing, and someone mentioned, one of the three of you mentioned about you mentioned about turning up to training, and we're doing a shuttle run, or we're running around the pitch for 4 laps, and it really didn't form any purpose in terms of the broader program for whatever you were working towards. It's the exact same principle in a school context. It needs to form, it shouldn't be done in isolation. It needs to form part of a broader, as I mentioned earlier, fitness education unit. So what would I do? Well, in the first place, I would make sure that if a student is coming in to do something like a standing broad jump test, or a hand grip string test, or whatever the test might be, a plank hold, they should have prior experience in trying to do that test. So what I did for my doctoral study was I did it over a 3-week period. The first week was no data was gathered, and it was an opportunity for students just to try out the tests. So they did it in the exact same format as they would be doing it the following week, but this time no data was recorded. So they just got familiar with the protocol of how to perform the tests. And we know, particularly with younger people, and I'm sure as the three of you will have seen in working with athletic populations, there's a huge practice effect. So if I was to, get three people who've never done a standing broad jump before and get them to perform it 3 times without giving any cues, feedback, or any information how they could improve their performance, the likelihood is that they wouldn't be their 3 best efforts. Whereas if I was to bring them in, I'd be pretty confident that I could get them to jump, 10, 20 centimeters further than they had done the previous 3 times. So that idea of giving students the opportunity to familiarize themselves with how to perform the tests, that would be one, initial step. Secondly, then I really like how some teachers are implementing them or integrating them as part of, a fitness activity profile, where the purpose isn't for fitness testing's sake. It's actually to inform whatever it is in your profile that you want to work towards. So, it might be that a particular student is involved in basketball and they feel that they could improve their vertical jump. Well, they compare their results to normative scores or criterion reference scores for their age group, and they see that they're slightly below what would be considered maybe, in the higher percentile. So therefore, based on that, they develop a program to go and work on that then. So I think it's really about it forming just one part of a jigsaw as opposed to, it being the entire thing,
Because you've provided some of those norms, or you've analysed them and stuff. Like I got ones off you. I just haven't stuck up on posters in school. Just colour coded them. Was it green, yellow, and red? I suppose subliminally squeeze in some Carlow colours, no extra school. But it's almost like your traffic light system that when we do some testing and they're planning their next 6 weeks before we do a block of retest and like that, they can go out and check themselves off then based on where they rank in terms of the overall population in their age and stuff. That's really useful. It's not just a number you get, it gives it a little bit more meaning to it and kind of highlights, well, I probably do have room for improvement here, and just highlights the importance of maybe why cardiorespiratory endurance or whatever it is somewhat important for health.
Just on that, John, like the data that I'm giving you there, unfortunately, actually isn't Irish data, because we don't have that data in Ireland. We don't have health-related fitness data for across adolescent age groups, among representative samples of Irish youth from 12 right up, and you can go down younger if you want, but just focusing on adolescents from 12, 13 right up to 17, 18, that data is based on European normative values. So it's definitely an area that merits attention, because we know I like the idea of criterion reference norms, but a criterion reference norm has to be generated from a specific population, and if that population isn't reflective of your population, then it's actually not relevant. So the best place to generate your norms from are the populations that you're working with, and in our case it's in Irish context. So it's definitely an area worth that merits further research in the future.
To be fair, one of the norms I generate myself, like we don't do the beep test, we do a 6-minute run instead. It's just the beep test caused so much drama. I couldn't be coping with it anymore. Whereas 6-minute run in our specific PE hall, we just have norms of that for different year groups over 6 years, so it's easy to work on all of that. And then the odd time we would have crossed it or compared it across the beep test a few times we did that, and like we're happy enough with what's on each, like quartile range or whatever that. That's
class. It's class to have that pool of data to kind of reference. But just on the bleep test, and I agree with you, it's a really difficult one to implement in school settings. And to be honest, if it's done the way I did a survey of how teachers were integrating tests, and what I found, or what it showed, is that the vast majority of teachers discarded results after a single use. So obviously that would suggest that it's serving very, very little purpose, and less than 1/3 of teachers gave feedback directly to the students on their performance score. So what's actually happening with these test results? But if you are using it, and it can be used well, like just simple measures like not having all 24 students in your class run up and down to the beep at the same time. Split your class in half and have one student record their peer. And straight away it takes the attention away from maybe being the first to drop out, or being the first of your entire class to drop out. Another simple thing that I did for my study was I put music in the background, and again it just takes away from the monotony of a constant beep be just having music playing in the background of the track, you know, can be a motivational influence. And you want them to try and max out. That's the purpose of the test. So yeah, look, just a kind of a tangent there. If teachers are doing it, you're better off not doing it. If you're just going in, they're turning up one day and you're running it with no wider purpose, like, you know.
No, I found the exact same with beep test. There is actually on YouTube one with music as the background. It's good and they call out nice and loud. I downloaded that and used it a couple of times. But just for classroom management, I find a 6-minute run way better, because you know how long the test is going to take. Everyone is active for 6 minutes. We're just doing a 25-metre shuttle. Obviously not ideal with the amount of turns and stuff built in, but you've no idea after about a minute who's ahead or who's behind who. Everyone's just going up and down to it, so there's no highlight on who's doing well, which sometimes can be quite intimidating. If you're the last person left doing the beep test, you're like, oh, I better not try too hard now.
Yeah, very true.
Looking at me. Yeah. And some of the lazier students will be gone on level 5, like.
Yeah. Listen, and that probably is the trade-off. The only counter argument to that is pacing. So, like, you know, if I'm doing a 6-minute run, do I know how hard I can go from that initial, you know, shuttle? Should I be pushing myself further, or, you know, it's that's the kind of trade-off between the prescribed beep and the away you go for the 6-minute. But from what you're describing there, I definitely see huge merit in that idea of a 6-minute takes the attention away if everyone is going around. Probably maybe you're working in a 25-metre space there, but if it happened to be a dry day and you could extend the area to, you know, a 100-metre circuit or a 50, better again, like, you know.
Yeah, if you had a track, like, or something like that, it'd be ideal, but it's just to keep it as consistent as possible. Just last question around that. You mentioned there some countries test 3 times a year. Like, ideally, how often should we do it? Is it something you'd look to do maybe 3 times, kind of September, January, May, or is there a need to be as rigid around that, or what have you found?
Yeah, I don't see any need for that level of, you know, to be doing it 2 or 3 times a year, like, you know, if you know. And again, it comes back to it, okay, is this for the purpose of data gathering, or is it for the purpose of, you know, are you doing it as part of your P program? If it's data gathering, you know, I still think, you know, once is more than enough per year to get a real rich sample. Once it's, you know, tracked over time, then and repeated. But yeah, like, there's no, you know, I wouldn't say there's any optimum number, but I definitely think you can probably overemphasize it as well. I am aware of schools that do it each term, and I'm kind of thinking, how much time is that taking away from, you know, other content areas? So I think once and it forming part of a broader unit, whatever it is that you're focusing on, that's really the key.
We've touched on a few of these already, but around best practices and stuff when testing and all in school. But just in terms of logistics, when you're setting up to do it, because I know you've done quite a lot on this and you've presented a few times to PAI, but even setting up the testing in the school, what's kind of the best format to put that together? And you could even touch a little bit there on what tests you actually use and everything.
Yeah, so what I found is a station format. A small group design really works well for this type of content. And you know it's the same. You know, I'm conscious that a lot of the people that listen to the podcast as well are coming from, you know, a sport background. So I would say the exact same can apply if you're testing with a group, with a team or whatever. That you use a small station approach and you have one person leading at each station. Now, it's really important that the person at that station knows exactly, you know, what they're doing and are trained up in terms of how to do whatever test they're doing or oversee it. But what I used for the research was a station approach. Students in groups of no more than 5 or 6 students, and they work in pairs within that then on the tests. And I also, you know, part of the initial pilot trial, one of the outcomes from that was that one school actually included some senior cycle students to help them out at each station, and I just thought that was an excellent idea, and I used that then for the expansion phase with 20 schools, where when I used to visit the school, I used to train up not just the PE teacher or the PE departments in the school, but also 5 or 6 senior cycle students who would then help out in terms of, okay, this is how you do the hand grip strength, the the plank hold. We did a 4x10 meter shuttle run, which, you know, a lot of the tests, John, that we used were from the Alpha test battery, which is, you know, has really strong data backing it up in terms of the validity and reliability of the measures used. So they were, just to list them out, they were the 4x10 meter shuttle run. They were the plank hold, repeated push-up test, standing broad jump test, hand grip strength, and then for body composition, even though it isn't a direct measure, but what's appropriate within schools, they use the BMI, so measure a measure of your height for your weight. But I wouldn't even be bothered with, in most schools, I wouldn't be bothered with the body composition measure. You might introduce it. Some teachers do it. If it's done well, no problem at all. But that's essentially how I would set it up. Small group, station approach, teach the students how to perform the test, and then let them do it and rotate around, give them 5 or 6 minutes. Don't rush them at the station. The purpose isn't really, to do as many trials as you can. It's to do it, do it properly. So that's what we used, and it seemed to be kind of well received by both the teachers and students based on the data we gathered. That's how it went. Yeah.
The weight of students can be an area to be cautious around. We allow them to do it themselves, but it's entirely their own choice. I just pull out all the gymnastics mats, so have them stacked really high, leave the weighing scales around the far side. So if you want to go and weigh yourself, you can weigh yourself, record it, and you fold over your sheet so no one else ever has to see it. If you want to show it to anyone else, you can show it to anyone else, but it's something I'm really, really conscious of. You're not asking anyone else, you're not looking at anyone else doing it, so it's there for you as an option, but definitely don't force it on anyone.
Yeah, really good suggestion. And obviously with body image related concerns and that, like there again, there's a trade off, and probably the cons outweigh the pros in that particular instance. So it's again, there are some schools that I've no doubt are can do it as you're describing there in a very kind of suitable manner. But it's definitely something to be mindful of if you are using it.
And when we gather results, or we've gone through tests and everything, what's the best way then to report that to students? Are you looking to report that to parents? What have you found works well there?
Yeah, again, in terms of the students, the students should be the ones gathering the data themselves to use towards a broader project, whatever that might be. A physical activity profile or a needs analysis for improvement in a specific sport. That's very much up to the teacher to frame it within a broader purpose of a fitness education unit or whatever it is that you're focusing on. In terms of it then going back to the parents, I actually did do that while I was teaching in Glinstall, and I found what was happening at parent teacher meetings. It was almost the first question they were asking me then: how did Johnny get on this year? You mentioned last year or whatever. So it's it depends on the context. It's up to the teacher. It's not something that I'd obsess over. It's not something that I'd be sending home every time. It's something again that can just form part of maybe your feedback to how a student is getting on in the PE setting or class. Yeah.
You've done a bit of qualitative work, just asking students. You mentioned a little bit on there now how they feel about it, how it makes them more comfortable and everything. But if you're trying to create a positive atmosphere around fitness tests in school, so it's not fitness tests today, I'm dreading this, or just trying to create something that they don't see negative. May not be necessarily something they really, really look forward to, but definitely something they don't dread. What are some things we can do there to make it as positive as possible, or to try and keep students as engaged as possible?
Yeah, it probably sounds like I keep repeating myself here, but it really comes back to that. It forms part of, it's not just implemented off the cuff in isolation that the students turn up to the class. It's a good idea that it would form part of a unit of learning as opposed to a standalone class, and that students are prepared for it. And I think again, that small group learner-centered approach, as opposed to let's all line up here one by one and do a standing broad jump. Divide your class into small groups and allow them to work through each station and each measurement focus themselves, and that like that for me straight away, it takes away the attention away from all eyes on one person. You know, it allows them to do it in their own time. It builds that sense of autonomy, which we know is really, really important in terms of what defines a successful lesson. That students, what I call the 3 A's, that students are active, autonomous, and accountable for their learning. And that stationed approach can really facilitate that.
Because even if you think of like, what are things that make a PE lesson enjoyable anyway? Being with your friends and listening to music are nearly always the two things that, like, I do questionnaires start every year, particularly the senior year groups, what do you want this year? And they're always the big two. Play music that we like, so my own playlist are obviously banned, and can we be with our friends? And once there's some element of that in there, whether it be fitness testing, whether it be badminton, whether it be whatever, they generally like PE more than if they're not options are there. From like questioning various schools and various teachers, speaking to people at conferences, and just even anecdotal evidence, what are some things we should certainly seek to avoid, or maybe some things you've seen done in the past, like, yeah, don't think that's a good idea, I try not to in future?
Yeah, well, one that immediately jumps to mind is the posting of test result scores in the gym hall, and like that's fine if you're working with an elite group, if you're working with an inter-county team or whatever, or a club, and you're posting the scores in the local gym for them to work towards. But in a school setting, that really isn't appropriate, and I have seen it being done. Now, you know, one way to mitigate against that is that you might actually just post the top 3 scores, and it gives the students that are the higher level students, they need to be, you know, interested in performing well as well, so have something to work towards. So rather than listing 24 students and having, you know, Brendan number 24 performing the worst in every single test, and John at number 1, just list the top 3. Just list the top three tests. I know you're keeping fit these days, John. So I had you up there at number 1. But it's a simple measure. I have seen it being done in schools both ways. But I would definitely avoid any public display of results that really should be avoided. One other one that springs to mind as well is, I mentioned earlier about conducting tests all with the whole group at once, and I really don't think that that's appropriate. So whatever tests that you're implementing, if it can be done in smaller groups, and I know there are particular ones that, you know, that makes it difficult to not send all the students off at once and do it, but I think it takes attention away from the individual, the smaller the groups that you can use. So they'd be just two simple ones. Yeah.
Another one I found that I definitely recommend avoiding is basing a grade off a performance in a test. If a student like gets a result in a test and is able to make meaning of that through reflection, or make a future goal to try and improve on, that can be a really good way of basing some form of grade or whatever your reporting thing is. But straight up, Shane there gets, I think based off your results when we were doing some of the tests in the Masters, right, 16.8 in the BEEP test. Brendan and Damien there, Kerry footballers, getting 12 points up, and me around 10.1, just automatically going A, 2 B's and a C, just based off that isn't really anything. But what does you getting that score mean, and a little paragraph or a few bullet points on that, and how much sense they make of what score they've gotten, can be far more beneficial to them if you are going that route of grading and linking it somewhat back to test scores.
100%, and like just on that, when I'm teaching this to third level students, to pre-service PE teachers, something I constantly stress with them is that I'm not bothered if you improve 2 levels on whatever, or if you increase your standing broad jump or increase your hand grip strength by whatever kg. It's really your capacity to reflect upon your training program and what worked well and what didn't work. That's really where the focus should be at. So yeah, it's a really good point, and not related to grades. It is done. It's done in the US. It's very common in the US actually for your HRPF scores to be related to your academic grade. Yeah.
There's a lot of, this may be kind of anecdotal, but isn't a lot of your kind of overall grade for PE based on your result in some of these fitness tests in America? Like you hear all the time people like, oh, I couldn't climb the rope, so I kind of failed gym or failed PE, kind of that side of things. So obviously I presume this is something we want to avoid like the plague going forward as we're kind of implementing this.
Yeah, you're right, Jane. It would have been, no, it's changing, to be fair, but there is definitely more of an obsession in the States around what they would call like performance criteria and meeting certain levels of performance. They have a President's Award for this, like, you know, so it's definitely more commonplace there. And we know that there are certain states that mandate the testing and relate it back to and use it as the sole measure of performance in PE, how you get on in these tests, which we know might form, you know, just, you know, a couple of classes in an entire PE unit. So yes, it's probably, you know, it is changing. There is a kind of a realization that the obsession shouldn't be over what the result is. It's more the process and it being used as information to inform something else. So yes, popular, but probably there is definitely there are positive changes in the States in that regard. Yeah.
You mentioned there about the kind of East-West divide, that over in Eastern Europe they tend to do far more mandated testing and stuff. From chatting to people, what are attitudes towards fitness like there? Do they see it as, like, I'm not sure what the right wording around this is, but are they more like regimented towards, okay, we have to perform in these tests, or are they just a little bit more laissez-faire because they're so used to doing tests quite repeatedly over the course of their time in school, and does it have knock-on impacts on higher or lower fitness levels?
Yeah, I think straight away the first thing to say was that the tests have huge status in those countries. Like, you know, they're really, you know, I was at a conference in Zagreb in Croatia, and like a lot of the posters and presentations were around that SlowFit battery that I mentioned and the NetFit one in Hungary, and you know, it's what stood out to me really is that in Western countries, you'd have a lot of debate around the purpose, whereas there it's seen as really, you know, as the poster, it's almost looked up to, like this data is so important and it forms a really important part of their learning. Now, you know, you could argue that's probably a narrow view of what, you know, PE and more broadly health should be, but that's how I'd say they'd have a very narrow or they would. Well, yeah, that might be, you know, that might be putting it in the wrong context, but they do place huge emphasis on it, and it seems to carry a lot of weight and have a lot of status. Your test scores. That's one thing. That's one thing I would have seen. Like, yeah.
So that, I was probably getting a bit political now, but because that's slightly aligned to, like, more Eastern European countries would align, like, status of the country with performance in elite level sport and performance. So having better fitness test scores at a younger level possibly increases their chances of that. Like, you would hear in Russia that you win an Olympic medal, you get a new house and a new car, and like they really put huge emphasis in rewarding elite sporting high level performance, and because that's possibly a precursor to that, is that why they maybe put more emphasis on it?
Yeah, it probably is. It's just probably you know, a product of the societal values, you know. Yeah, and that's just the reality. We you know, and we're kind of moving further away from that rigid notion of, you know, we're moving more towards the well-being space and that kind of holistic view of, okay, what does it actually mean to be healthy? Their healthy discourse is probably very much around, you know, what would be considered avoiding, you know, disease, staying fit. Whereas we're kind of that more what's called salutogenic. So, like, you know, around, you know, that holistic approach to health. It doesn't just mean that you can be, you know, that you need to be exceptionally physically fit. It's more complex and broad than that. Like, yeah.
I suppose, not maybe exactly your area, but I definitely like to get your insights into it a little bit, just kind of on that area. If you look at, say, obesity rates amongst teenagers in Ireland, and I suppose the jumps that they've been making over the last 25, 30 years, when you look at PE as being, say, the class in school that, you know, it does provide that, you know, bit of access to activity, first off, as well as exercise that maybe some students wouldn't have outside of school. But I suppose when you look at those rates of obesity increasing, do you see it? Obviously, it's not just on school; it's a societal thing as well. But what kind of impacts do you see PE having going forward in trying to maybe slow down this jump or this increase, sorry, in obesity that we are seeing amongst teenagers and then on to adulthood. Do you see an impact kind of coming there through, obviously we're talking about fitness testing here, this is your area of speciality, but just from maybe your anecdotal viewing of things, the experience that you have had in researching these things, do you think there is a significant impact on the way into that, or do you think it's still largely a much more wider societal thing that PE as a subject won't be able to kind of curtail a little?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Damien. I think that, you know, for years we've tried to almost sell ourselves as the, you know, the solution to the obesity pandemic, you know, and that really, for me, you know, it's not an achievable outcome for anyone that's attending, you know, a single or a double period a week. You know, that's not, you know, it shouldn't be our focus. Just interestingly enough, on obesity rates and things, we're actually seeing a bit of a, you know, a steadying off or a plateauing of increase in obesity. If you were to take data for the last 10 years, again, the biggest data pool that we can call on from an Irish context, there's the Growing Up in Ireland, yes, but also the CESPA study specifically for adolescent populations, and there actually has been little or no change in the past decade. So we're seeing a bit of a plateauing there, but it's still 1 in 4. It's roughly, you know, 25%, 20 to 25%, which is really high. But to go back to, you know, to your question, I do see schools as being the primary vehicle to promote healthy behaviours amongst children and adolescents, because obviously all children, adolescents need to attend school, and within that, then within schools I see PE as being like the cornerstone for whole school approaches to physical activity promotion, because at the end of the day, the PE teacher is probably the most qualified person in the school to give advice on, okay, how can we promote different initiatives to promote physical activity. And, you know, there's some really good stuff. There's things like the Active School Flag that's happening, where, you know, it's not just left to the PE teachers themselves for that 40 or 80 minute period a week to influence positive change in terms of physical activity behavior. It's a more whole school approach, and teachers from different subject disciplines taking on responsibility for doing different things. And this isn't just around sport and extracurricular, you know, activity. It can be like walks. It can be, you know, setting up a school gym and giving students access to the gym during break times. And to go back to the, you know, to your question, no, I don't see it being as a silver bullet solution and I don't think we should use it as that, because that's not an achievable outcome. But yes, I do see schools in the first place as being the primary vehicle, and within that, you know, the PE teacher and PE class being being the cornerstone then within the school setting to promote healthy lives. And I wouldn't see it. I wouldn't, like, the goal shouldn't be, okay, let's reduce that's, you know, that may come, or that hopefully will come if we can instill behavior change. We shouldn't obsess over the figure, like, you know, the outcome, more the process.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, and it is great to see that kind of plateau, because it was getting quite worrying. But I do think that whole school approach kind of being led from a position of actual knowledge and a base in what's you know, what the actual overall goal is, to obviously just increase that understanding of what physical activity is, I suppose, first and foremost. If I'm to think back to my own time in school, or any teenagers that I would know at the moment, that, you know, often when you do mention physical activity, it can be viewed as exercise, and it's kind of like, no, it's just overall physical activity and how to go about increasing that. But I think I think you've hit the nail on the head, that it's like a full school approach there, but that is being led, the cornerstone is being led by those in the know, the PE teachers with the background. That I think that is very important. And I suppose that's more for people listening here today, just that could be something to maybe start engaging in a little bit more, if it is something that maybe they feel is lacking a little bit.
Just on the schools element as well, in a fairly heated debate with a reasonably high-ranking official in Croke Park about one day, just to me, John, PE in Ireland has failed the country. And I was like, I'm not going to say his name, but go on, expand on that there a bit now before I respond. I said, we've had PE in the country for however many years, and we're getting heavier and unfitter, not healthier. PE has failed. I'm like, massive sweeping statement, but just like, let's break it down to numbers. The recommendations for children and adolescents to get 1 hour every day. So that's 60 minutes, 365 days a year. Current recommendations for PE are what? An hour a week? So you're in school 33 weeks a year, which means if all your activity was based on going to PE, you get 9% of the amount you're supposed to get. So if you were like fully active for those 60 minutes every single week in PE, you're still not even getting 10% of what you're supposed to get. So to expect PE to cure all those problems, it's just not on at all. And even like, we probably need to change our view on, probably has been a bit recently, but like what a PE teacher's role is, not just in PE class but in the wider school. Like generally you look at the PE teacher as, oh, they do the sport, they look after sports teams. So say if you're looking after the sports teams, like I'll just take my own school for example, we largely end up catering to the elite, those who are already really active, often to the point of probably doing too much, and really good school for PE. They've won a few All-Irelands, they've won this, they've won that. And really, that's not reflective of PE at all. That's reflective of the top 4 or 5% of students in the school who excel at that. And that often means because you're expected to put so much time into making the elite even better, you completely, I won't say disregard, but end up taking your eyes off the bottom 10% who really, really need your help. But like, there's no real emphasis put on meeting their needs or anything like that as well. I'm not going to go too deep down this rabbit hole now, but I think there are bits to be mindful of as well.
Like the sweeping statement of PE having failed the country, I think, like, you know, it's such a narrow view in terms of what the purpose of the subject is, and it goes back to what Damien was mentioning earlier, and what I spoke about of what's actually achievable, and you know, I think, you know, if you were to base it on that, you could make the same argument for any of the more traditional academic subjects that we've seen numeracy and literacy levels fall. So does that mean that maths and English are also failing the country? So I think, you know, that argument for me, you know, it's one I'd happily debate. You know, it's very narrow. But just one other one I wanted to pick up on was like that sport is distinct from PE in a school setting, but they're both really important pillars of what should form a whole school approach to physical activity promotion. And I think it's great that some schools like are really keen on sporting endeavours and achieving success in that regard. But, you know, PE is distinct from that, but also has a really important role, John, for you, as you mentioned, the students that maybe aren't part of those teams, and that idea of probably the students that you really need to target most, and creating activity opportunities for them. So it comes back to that idea of, you know, a system-wide approach, whole school approach, and multiple avenues for engagement in physical activity. Yeah.
I think that's why the holistic view of health for PE is so important, because arguably when the obesity levels were going up and up, it wasn't that everyone was getting less fit, it was the split was getting bigger. So your elite athletes or your kind of better athletes were getting fitter, better, faster, stronger, and it's just the other group who maybe didn't find a sport would just drop off completely. So it got rid of that kind of average, for lack of a better word, person kind of in the middle, like the median, and that's where we arguably should have most people who want to live healthy who just aren't particularly sporting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely, Shane. And actually, on that, it's one thing I didn't mention about the study. The same paper that John was referring to there, about the one we did the comparison between Irish and European level norms. There was the main part of that paper was actually looking at schools in Ireland, and one of the biggest findings was the disparity in fitness levels between schools, what are called DESH schools, and non-DESH schools, so designated disadvantaged schools. So what it essentially showed was that there's a huge disparity between those students that are in non-DESH or in DESH schools, and more often than not, they're the ones that we need to target. They're probably the ones that are not involved. We know from research on the impact of socioeconomic status on activity that their activity opportunities are far more limited. So I think that's probably something we didn't touch upon earlier, but is important to point out in terms of where we need to target the most, and that gap is probably widening.
Yeah, really important point. I think when Stephen Bean was on, he said that the fundamental movement skills were the exact same. They were just way better or way worse in the disadvantaged areas. Sarah McQuinn, who was on before as well, doing her PhD largely around girls in disadvantaged areas. How can we get them more active? Because the strategies used to get others more active needs to be quite different because a one size fits all approach doesn't seem to work there. Just one or two little things to wrap up then. If you are a teacher in a school and you notice that, without it being the purpose, but you have noticed that fitness levels are quite low in a group or in the school as a whole, what are some meaningful ways you can do to possibly look to bring levels up? Or is it a much bigger picture approach than what one teacher can do in that one class? And kind of ties into Damien's point there as well.
Yeah, look, and again, I think first and foremost, the teacher in their own context is the person that's most well informed about how to go about, we'll say, dealing with a situation that you described there. So the context of the school is really important, because what I might say mightn't be suitable for the all girls deaf school in the middle of Limerick City, we'll just say, in comparison to, a school, private fee paying school, in the suburbs that has access to every single facility that you could imagine. So I think, in the first place, the context is really, really key. But it goes back to creating opportunities to be active. So if we're looking at it from a school level, not just a PE level now, it really comes back to, okay, how can we create opportunities to be active in school? And there are certain periods in the day where students aren't in the class. That's before school, break time, and after school, where we can create opportunities to be active. And I know people like Mike Story there. He was based in Villiers School in Limerick, and it was one of the schools as part of my study. And I was travelling out to Villiers, and I arrived early one morning around 8:05. The sports hall was full of students doing a circuit. And Mike was telling me that these are the students that may not be involved in the rugby team or the hockey team. They were just coming in to be active. So it's that idea of the time that we have students in school. So whether it's before, during lunch breaks, and after, facilitating activity and on that. And one thing that we can probably look at too is around uniform, and it's kind of a bugbear of mine, but oftentimes the school uniform is actually restrictive in terms of how much physical activity can take place outside of maybe a PE context where students can change and be active. But we're seeing a lot of research now in Australia in particular to show that what students actually are allowed wear to school has a big influence in terms of how physically active they are during the school week. So if we allow students to wear active wear, if we can redesign our uniforms to make them more appropriate for moving, then what a very simple and basic measure to promote physical activity, so that students don't need to be worried about having to change at break time or before school, that that they can be active at any opportunity that presents itself to be active. And that particularly might be more effective for those students who aren't as invested in the sport, who aren't maybe the higher level achievers in a sporting context.
And just lastly then, what are some, you've kind of touched on a bit as well, what are some future directions you'd like to see in terms of research on fitness testing in general, or just even fitness levels in schools or in adolescents in general, that you'd like to see, or that you're interested in maybe going a little bit further down that route yourself?
Yeah, well, firstly, in terms of fitness testing specifically to the school context, I think we really need to start at this stage, or to stop at this stage, obsessing over, why is fitness testing being done? We need to start obsessing over how it's being done. So, it's very much around the how. And that goes really for any practice in a phys ed context, that we need to start thinking about how best to implement, as opposed to why are we doing it in the first place. Because we at this stage now have empirical evidence to support its use in a positive context in a PE setting. So, for me, we need to move beyond that debate and focus our energies more on, okay, how best can we implement it? And I know researchers like Laura Alfrey in Australia are doing a lot of work in this regard in terms of how best can we do it in a manner that promotes activity and students really enjoy. So that's the media. I forget the second part of that question, John, that you asked. You were sorry there.
Just around fitness levels in schools or adolescents in general, what's some kind of future directions we could look at there?
Yeah, sorry, good man. So I think more broadly speaking, I think that it's a case of getting the data, and that's I'm not talking about from in a PE context here. I think we need to look at a national survey of adolescents in Ireland, of the health-related physical fitness levels of adolescents in Ireland, and this might form one arm of the future CISPA studies or a standalone research project in itself. But right now we just don't have that information, and I think that's an initial important step to allow us to know where we're at, essentially. So if we don't have the data, we're working off a blank map really without any direction.
That's been excellent, so Brendan. If anyone wants to get in touch, or if now in your new role in UL, if someone is interested in doing some of this research or getting involved in some of it, where can they contact you or find out a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mainly use. I'm not great in the social media side of things. Twitter would be the main one that I use. So you'll get me at Brendan O'Keefe on Twitter. But also, if you're interested in this area and you'd like to pursue further research, or find out more, or I can share any of the papers that we've done, just drop me an email, brendan.o'keefe@ul.ie, and I'll happily engage with you there. Yeah.
No, that's excellent. Thanks a million, and we may get you back again at some stage in the future when stuff evolves a little bit more.
Super stuff, lads. Thanks.